Mountain News, First at 4, continues.
Republican candidates running for governor and the constitutional offices say they are united to win in November. Daniel Cameron was joined by 5 candidates seeking a Republican sweep this fall. WYMT's Phil Pendleton has more on what was said during a news conference this morning.
All the Republicans that won their respective offices statewide on Tuesday night were here today at the Republican Party headquarters saying they are unified, simply wanting to fire Andy Beshear this fall. Cameron and others say their agenda is simply separating themselves from Andy Beshear. Cameron blamed Beshear for not standing up to President Biden when it comes to immigration, saying that's resulted in more fentanyl coming into the state. House Speaker David Osborne says they want a governor that doesn't take credit for things he doesn't do. Cameron says they want a pro-growth and pro-family agenda, thanking the House Speaker and Senate President for pushing that.
You know, Speaker Osborne is right. Andy Beshear is, during this election season, going to try to take credit for things that he didn't do. I often tell people it's like the person who was born on third base but thinks they've hit a triple. And we're going to remind people of what his actual record is.
Senate President Robert Stiver says they want a governor that will set policy, stating that he believes that Andy Beshear never set any policy, simply wanting to run the state by himself, and some of the actions that he has performed over the past 3.5 years, such as during COVID and with the Department of Juvenile Justice. In Frankfort, Phil Pendleton, WKYT.
Phil, thank you. Meanwhile, Governor Beshear is kicking off his re-election campaign in Western Kentucky today.
Beautifully sunny skies out there all throughout the region on this Friday afternoon. TGIF sailing right into the weekend with beautiful sunny skies. Enjoy them now because changes are on the way. 77 from our studios here in Hazard. Just a few fair weather clouds out there right now. Temperatures region-wide approaching that 80-degree mark, especially for folks over in Manchester, Middlesboro, even over to Monticello and Harlan, seeing those temperatures above the 80-degree mark. But the dew points, for the most part, middle and upper 50s. That's the best direct measurement of the moisture at surface. And yeah, it's not that humid outside, so it feels pretty nice. We're all clear on pinpoint Doppler, maybe a sprinkle trying to go up there in the eastern parts of Morgan County. But other than that, your forecast first through the next 12 hours will keep it dry through sunset and a little bit beyond, but we'll drop those temperatures slowly into the 60s. And for many, we don't make it out of the 60s tomorrow thanks to clouds and widespread showers. The details on those coming up in just a few minutes, and when the beautiful weather moves back in. Join us in a little bit, will you?
All right, Evan, thank you. President Joe Biden is in Japan meeting with other world leaders during the G7 summit. They are expected to discuss Russia's sanctions and support for Ukraine, among other topics. WYMT White House correspondent John Decker is traveling with the president and joins us now live from Hiroshima, Japan. And John, day one of the G7 summit is now already over. What was accomplished and what was on the president's agenda?
Well, big focus on day one on what you just spoke about, Steve. That is the issue of the war in Ukraine, and what the G7 leaders committed to doing in a joint statement is committed to continuing to supply Ukraine with military assistance, also economic aid, humanitarian aid, and also committing to rebuilding Ukraine, but at the same time holding Russia responsible. The statement also calls for additional sanctions to be placed upon Russia, preventing critical technology from getting to Russia that they can use in their war machine, that they can use to prosecute the war, and also targeting Russia's use of the international banking system. You have to also keep in mind that these sanctions are on top of sanctions that have been already placed upon Russia by these G7 countries during the course of the past 15 months of the war in Ukraine.
John, I understand Ukrainian President Zelensky is going to attend, or maybe already there. What have you learned about that?
That's right. I got additional details about that. Also, you have to understand that President Zelensky has addressed the G7 before. Last year, when the G7 summit was in Germany in the Bavarian Alps, President Zelensky addressed G7 leaders, but that was virtually. This will be in person, and I've been told that that address will occur on Sunday, the third day, the final day of the G7 summit. I think his visit here is twofold. One, to express his gratitude for all of the help, the assistance that G7 countries, including the U.S., have provided to Ukraine since the war against Ukraine began in February of last year, but also continuing to ask for more military assistance, more lethal aid, more offensive weapons. We know that the U.S. has given tacit approval to other allied countries to provide F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. That's something that President Zelensky has been asking for quite some time.
I know China is another big focus there at the G7. Tell us about that.
Well, that's right. That's what will be the focus on day 2 of the G7 summit. China. China is considered by the U.S. to be a bad actor as it relates to its trade and economic policies. It steals U.S. intellectual property. It often blocks American companies and other G7 companies from doing business in China. So the G7 leaders are going to respond to that. We'll see what that response is today, how to respond to a country that is the second largest economy in the world. And for every G7 country, the trade imbalance always favors China. So that will be an interesting thing to see what comes out of those discussions today.
Well, John, of course, looming over this summit is the very real concern that the U.S. will default on its debt obligations. Has the White House provided any update today on whether a deal is in reach to avoid a default?
Yes, Steve. In the past few hours, I've spoken to a very senior administration official who has expressed that same level of confidence that President Biden has expressed as it relates to getting to the point where there is a deal concerning the debt ceiling. We know that that same level of confidence also shared by the leader for the House of Representatives, that's Speaker McCarthy, who says he sees a path forward towards getting to the point of an agreement. The president, following the conclusion of this summit on Sunday, immediately flying back to Washington, D.C. It's a pivotal week in terms of getting to a deal. Reason being is because of that June 1st deadline. That's when the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, has said the U.S. could default on its debt obligations unless there is a deal between the White House and congressional Republicans to extend the debt ceiling.
And John, why is this also a concern for other G7 leaders?
The reason being is because you can't just figure that this would impact just the U.S. if the U.S. defaulted on its debt. It would have disastrous implications for the global economy and world financial markets. It would have an impact on every G7 country as well. That's why the president has been trying to assure his G7 counterparts that a deal ultimately will be reached and the U.S. will not default on its debt obligations for the first time in our history.
All right, John Decker will be following the events there closely, live in Hiroshima, Japan for us today. Maybe the first live report we've ever done on WYMT from Hiroshima. Thank you very much. Well, one Pike County student is saying goodbye to elementary school and hello to college. Jaylee Hall is a 14-year-old who used her last year as a Johns Creek 8th grader to prepare for her undergraduate years. From homeschool to Penn Foster to the University of Pikeville, she finished her high school diploma in around 7 weeks and is now graduating from high school when she would have originally graduated 8th grade.
After I finish at U Pike, I want to go to medical school. And then once I finish medical school and once I become a neurologist, I want to come back here and start.
Hall says she's excited for this next chapter and a little nervous about the big changes in store. In Nevada, their governor rejected 3 gun regulation bills from Democratic lawmakers this week. One of the bills was aimed at raising the age of owning an assault weapon to 21. The others would have placed restrictions on ghost guns and having a firearm near polling sites. One Democratic lawmaker says these were bipartisan issues in other states and that the governor should look past his party.
Instead of engaging in good faith with the legislature on these common sense gun safety bills that are in the best interest of public safety for our children and our communities, he has decided to side with the radical portion of his base.
Their governor says the bills infringed on the First Amendment rights of the people of Nevada. Shenandoah National Park is celebrating the donation of 1,000 acres of land to the park. The new Tanner's Ridge site is located just outside of Stanley, Virginia. The Shenandoah National Park Trust purchased the land from 3 families and donated it to the park late last year. Colby Johnson has that story.
The primary purpose was conservation. Naked Creek flows through these lands. It's a tributary of the Shenandoah River. So the ability to protect these lands, to protect the watershed for the long term, was the primary goal.
The historic land donation is a big win for the National Park Service's America the Beautiful program, which works with willing sellers to expand the footprint of conserved land in the U.S.
The conservation mission is critical here, and this area is ecologically important, has watershed protection, so it adds to our overall land base here that will really be important in the whole corridor of this park.
The Shenandoah National Park Trust purchased the land in 2021 with funds from a settlement between Virginia and the DuPont Chemical Company. The Trust and Park say they're grateful to the Bradford, Dean, and Graves families for selling their land to be preserved.
To help us meet our mission, we need to have that local engagement, that local connection, so that we can preserve the area for the future.
The land is home to many native plant and animal species, and the park will now work to keep it in pristine condition.
We'll be managing invasive species and things like that, providing wildlife habitat. The lands will be open to the public as part of the national park, but at this time we don't have any plans for developing trails or things like that.